we will discuss the book, The Man Who Lived Underground, written by noted author Richard Wright with his eldest daughter, Julia Wright. I'd like to welcome the Elaine Legacy Center who partnered with us on this project, Edlin Marshall and Mary Olson, to say hello.
All righty, there we go. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Good, good. So I'm Edlin Marshall, and we would like to say welcome on behalf of the board of the Elaine Legacy Center located in Elaine, Arkansas. I welcome you to this historic presentation by Julia Wright, daughter of Richard Wright, the author whose favorite uncle was lynched in Elaine, Arkansas, back in 1916. We are proud to be partnering with Pyramid Books Arts, custom framing of Little Rock. Welcome.
Thank you, Edlin. So tonight our special guests are Julia Wright, the elder daughter of Richard Wright and the executor of his estate. And she has practiced journalism in Africa, Europe, and the United States. A prison rights advocate, a poet, an essayist. She wrote the introductions to Richard Wright's A Father's Law and to Mumia Abu-Jamal's Death Blossoms. She is currently writing a memoir in Southern Europe, and we're so excited to have you with us. Welcome, Julia. Our moderator this evening is the esteemed Reverend Judge Wendell Griffen. He's the pastor of New Millennium Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's a trustee of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and circuit judge for the 5th Division of the 6th Judicial Circuit Court of Arkansas. He has authored one book, The Fierce Urgency of Prophetic Hope. He's worked with 3 internet blogs and regularly writes articles for publications concerning social justice, faith, and public policy. And we're glad to have both of you here today. And we're excited about the conversation that is in front of us, and it is very historic, and we welcome all of you. And I will turn it over to Judge Griffen.
Thank you, Ms. Hearn, and welcome everyone. Good evening, Ms. Wright, and thank you for gracing us with your presence and the honor of talking with you about your father's book, The Man Who Lived Underground. It is a tremendous blessing to talk to you tonight, and especially it is momentous because this evening is the 1st anniversary of the murder of George Perry Floyd Jr. And so it is both momentous and it is sobering that we would be talking about this book, this prescient book that your father wrote in 1941. In 2021, on the 1st anniversary of the murder of George Floyd Jr. Thank you for talking with us. And I understand that you have, in commemoration of this event and the 1st anniversary, you penned a poem.
Yes, indeed.
Would you share it with us?
Oh, with pleasure. To Silas Hoskins and George Floyd, here's a quotation from Black Boy. "Why had we not fought back? I asked my mother. On the 1st anniversary of the day when so very slowly, so very pleasurably, so cruelly yet ropelessly, George Floyd was lynched. I greet you, native sons and daughters of Arkansas, where my great uncle, Silas Hoskins, was so very invisibly, so very silently, so cruelly, yet filmlessly lynched. From one century to the next, we still hammer at the rock of white silence. We still pour water on the drunkenness of sick pleasure. We still offer the libation of our spared breath to say their names. We do not have a body for disappeared Silas, so we will write on paper and hopefully on stone, May 25th, a death date for all our unburied soldiers. I'm very deeply moved to speak to you tonight, and so I think you may forgive me for using my notes as a prop. In one of his last letters to me, dated June 1960, my father wrote that he wished me well in all my endeavors, but he asked me to never estrange myself from the land that gave birth to him and molded him, his native South. And so it is a privilege to be with you here on his native soil, even virtually today. My parents had long prepared me to be the custodian of the man who lived underground. While my father was writing it in 1941, I was in my mother's womb. He was rehearsing fatherhood as the wife of his hero, Fred Daniels, was pregnant. And Fred Daniels is haunted by bodies of babies in the sewer. I was born alive. The book is my twin in more ways than one, and by getting this novel published, I truly feel I am my paper brother's keeper. Then I have another bond to the book. While he was writing it, Richard took an interest in a Black prisoner sentenced to life without parole called Clinton Brewer. My father's idea was that creativity could redeem criminal impulses, and he was impressed by the fact that Clinton Brewer had taught himself jazz composition behind bars. Richard interceded with the governor of New Jersey, obtained Brewer's release, and took the prisoner home to where I lay newborn in my cot. And so human rights prison work is my unquiet legacy. In the late 90s and the first part of this century, I was helping my late mother, Ellen, with the estate in Paris, and also freelancing as a journalist. After my father's centennial, I was toing and froing from Paris to death row in Pennsylvania, where I would visit Mumia Abu-Jamal, the award-winning Black journalist who was maintained for 3 decades in solitary confinement for a crime he has always maintained he is innocent of. On my way to Pennsylvania's death row in those years, I would stay in cities like New York and Philadelphia, where the police shootings of unarmed Black and brown people, as well as other vulnerable minorities, were daily events. I read about James Byrd's dismemberment as he was dragged behind a truck in Jasper, Texas. I heard of Abner Louima's sodomization by the police in New York, and of Amadou Diallo's death, shot down by 40 police bullets in the Big Apple. So when in July 2010, I went to Yale University to sift through my father's unpublished manuscripts, and I sat in the comfortable, secluded, air-conditioned calm of the Beinecker archives, where his papers are kept. The long version of the short story I knew so well jumped up at me like a time bomb. Why? Because it contained 50 hidden, censored pages describing in film-like detail the racist police violence against his Black hero. And these pages were like a time machine, fast forwarding the reader to all the suppressed videos of police brutality our families are trying to access today. To Darnella Fraser's courage. Bringing this work to light in its restored form is not only timely, it is a cure against the shock of the physical dismemberment suffered by all the James Byrds of our dark history. Back in the early 40s, before Emmett Till's lynching, before the civil rights movement, the uncut version of the book had been turned down, had been pushed underground, because the white publishers felt those pages about torture committed by state-sanctioned white police officers against an innocent Black man would be too, quote, uncomfortable, unbearable, unquote. In other words, too close to the truth. The original uncensored version has the same potentially healing impact as the video of the last long minutes of George Floyd's life has had on our nation. The reinstatement of the narrative of how too many of our lives end in the shadows. In the case of my great uncle Silas Hoskins, lynched in Elaine, there was no date of death, no body, no restored narrative, simply disappearance. The Man Who Lived Underground is a book for today. It is a book for yesterday. It is a book for tomorrow. Is America ready to claim all its restored narratives yet? And in honor of the anniversary, the first anniversary of the lynching of George Floyd, here is a short poem I wrote last June for him. Rope choke. That unremembered, painful breath drawn when born from mama, you inhaled fiery air from the icy white world for the first time. That last everlasting breath withdrawn when calling for mama, you choked as long as it takes for a rope to rob you of your time. Thank you.
Ms. Wright, you, as you mentioned, are a twin to the man who lived underground. It was written in 1941, the year you were born.
Yes.
And in 2010, you discovered that what had been released in 1941 as a short story was a full-length novel. How did you find it?
Well, the beginning of the story begins with my father's bookshelves. You know, my father didn't really want to talk about painful things with me, but he opened up his bookshelves to me. And that's how very early on, when I was 12, I read Black Boy for the first time. Found it very painful to read, and came across the short story you mentioned of the man who lived underground and loved it, and thought it was a mixture between a Black Kafka story or a Black Edgar Allan Poe story. My father loved Edgar Allan Poe. I just loved the story. But I didn't know that it had a beginning, and he never told me about that beginning. It was a total surprise.
When you found the long version, how did you discover it?
Well, you know, if you go to Beinica, I don't know if you've been there, it's so comfortable. There are carpets there, it's air conditioned, you're given gloves to handle the, you know, I was given gloves to handle the photographs of myself taken by my father when I was young. It was a wrench. It's a wrench to handle your own father's papers in a library, but I won't talk about that.
And this was at Yale.
This was at Yale. And when I came across that long manuscript, I couldn't believe my eyes.
And when you realized that the long manuscript had not been accepted for publication, that a publisher had actually rejected the manuscript.
Yes.
How did you feel?
how did I feel?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I felt, can I say it? Angry. I knew that he had to accept cuts in Native Son. Later on, after The Man Who Lived Underground, he would have to accept the second part of Black Boy to be cut out, American Hunger. It was white controlled publishing. And it was a double bind for Black writers in those days. If you wanted to get published, you had to accept the cuts. So he's smiling today.
Yeah, I imagine your father is in the ancestral realm saying, "That's my girl. That's my girl." Why did you think that this book needed to be published now? I'm almost embarrassed to ask the question, but I think that it's important that people know the reason why you wanted this published now. You discovered the long manuscript in 2010.
It's an extraordinary book because it's as if he was taking the lynchings he had written about in Uncle Tom's Children, and he was fast forwarding to the high-tech lynchings that are taking place today. And he's giving us a time machine in the form of a book.
What do you think your father felt about the deletion of the first 50 pages that dealt with police brutality in The Man Who Lived Underground? Because the short version didn't have those 50 pages that are so graphic and so they're searing.
Yes. He has an early biographer, a French biographer, who wrote that he felt that my father didn't mind, quote unquote. I beg to disagree. I think my father minded very much, but it's not that he had no choice. I think he decided to leave the United States because he was tired of seeing his writings dismembered.
It was almost as if his writings were being lynched, even like the characters he wrote about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
When you mentioned that your father's 1941 manuscript often it actually fast forwards to the 21st century, the high tech, you're engaging in The Man Who Lives Underground, this novel. You're engaging the Black Lives Matter generation. You're engaging the generation that came of age with Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown Jr. and on this first anniversary, George Floyd. And there are those who say that this generation doesn't read books, they're into videos. What's your message to them about The Man Who Lived Underground?
Well, I did hear that Native Son was #1 book borrowed by Black male prisoners in prisons. And Native Son was prescribed reading at one point in the Black Panther Party. I don't know what the man who lived underground will be or become, but I wrote an email to my son the other day that I believe the man who lived underground will become a classic.
You have me at a disadvantage because you're much more well-read and written than I, but I will share your estimation, and I will go this much. Just as Alex Haley's Roots was a classic,
Yes.
I believe that The Man Who Lived Underground may very well be a classic in the same kind of way. Let me ask you, what impact do you think the restoration of those first 50 pages, those pages dealing with police brutality, and I keep going back to police brutality because that is a theme and that runs throughout the novel. The restoration of those first 50 pages do you think on the rest of the book of Fred Daniels, the hero's experience in the sewer? And I don't want to be a spoiler for those who haven't read the book, but I would like you to talk about that.
Well, you know, that's why I think it's going to become a classic, because every time I read the book again, I have a different take on it. Even I. This time, I think that my father was trying to explore manufactured guilt. In other words, you know, planting the way those policemen were planting the seed of doubt in Fred Daniels' mind, were trying to destroy his innocence, his inner sense of innocence. And that is so terrible. When one is innocent and somebody comes up to you and destroys that sense of innocence in you, you are changed forever.
As you were speaking of that coerced sense of guilt, I reflected on the number of times that Black people who have been lynched by the police, these what I call state-sanctioned executions,
Yes.
by cops, when the police have come in question, one of the first things the media and police agencies do is begin to criminalize the victim, as opposed to point to the criminal behavior of the cop. Do you think that sense comes through in The Man Who Lived Underground?
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the whole frame up, what we call frame up. They criminalize the victim, and then the policemen become the victims. So everything is turned upside down. The policemen are the victims of those who are criminalized. So it's an upside down world.
An upside down world indeed. I suppose I should ask, in another sense, do you think that The Man Who Lived Underground should be required reading for all new police cadets?
I would love that. I think my father will be laughing at this point. He won't be smiling. Yes.
Well, if you will make the request, I'm sure that'll go a long way. And so I would like to encourage you to encourage, request, insist, instruct, even demand that police agencies read and distribute the men who lived underground to their training officers and to their new recruits, as well as to the politicians who give them immunity.
I think that is absolutely wonderful. Yes, I endorse.
I would also add, I think you should also be required reading for more than a few judges who somehow never seem to understand that what police officers say about people confessing and about how people have been brutalized isn't always the truth, as we've learned from body cam footage.
Yes, I remember the judge who sentenced Mumia Abu Jamal to death, Judge Sable, called the sentencing judge because he, I think he was the hanging judge, the person who sentenced the most people to death in the United States. He said, "I'm going to help them fry the nigger," about Mumia. Yeah.
We are going to give some time for questions that have been passed on to Anna Hearn to share with you to respond. And I want to do that, but I want to give you a chance to share anything else you want to share before we open the floor to questions, because I want to make sure I have touched on things you want to talk about.
Oh, okay. So right along, just exactly what you were saying. There are a few lines you were touching on this, so I will read exactly what he said. The thoughts came to him so hard that he thought he had actually yelled them out, but he had not spoken. His teeth were clenched. The words had screamed inside of him, hot words, trying to burst through a tight wall. And again, he was overwhelmed with that inescapable emotion that always cut down to the foundations of life here in the underground, that emotion that told him that though he were innocent, he was guilty. Though blameless, he was accused. Though living, he must die. Though possessing faculties of dignity, he must live a life of shame. Though existing in a seemingly reasonable world, he must die a certainly reasonless death.
Richard Wright, 1941, those words were written. They are as powerful in 2021 as they were when he wrote them. And they have especially powerful weight because you read them. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you very much.
I want to yield now to Anna Hearn, and Ms. Garbo Watson Hearn, who are going to introduce us to the questions that have been shared by the audience.
Thank both of you for that powerful conversation. We have a question for Julia. It says, what are your thoughts on the successful prosecution of Chauvin for George Floyd's murder?
I think that we must be very careful before we celebrate. Watching as a journalist, I was very careful to watch the context of his sentencing, And I noticed how many killings took place. The question is it backlash, or is it because we're paying more attention to those killings? So that would be an open question for the moment. But there are many more killings today.
I think it bears also worth remembering that Derek Chauvin almost was not prosecuted because the initial response of the Minneapolis prosecutor, and he made the public statement, was that there was some evidence that no crime had been committed. And the first report from the Minneapolis Police Department was that there had been a medical incident, not a lynching. So it's telling that we get we're on the first anniversary of the murder and we've got a conviction, but we have to remember, just as the 50 pages were excised from The Man Who Lived Underground, there was an effort to excise the criminality of what George Floyd suffered. And I think your father pushed that narrative in The Man Who Lived Underground quite well.
Yes.
So we have another question. We have another question. You read Black Boy when you were 12. This audience member read it in high school. And today on the news, there are 12 state legislators working on laws to prohibit teaching of systemic racism in school. Do you have thoughts about how this potential government censorship might impact access for young people to discover books like your father's?
You know, my thoughts about censorship are very biased because I come from a family where there has been a lot of censorship because my father went through the Cold War. My father was in the Communist Party before he left the Communist Party, and he was caught up in McCarthyism. Censorship is a murderous, heinous, inhuman thing. What can we do against censorship? We can do what Richard did, and that is go and find our own intellectual food outside of the boxes that are created for us. Outside of academics, outside of the schools, we have places to find these books, to lend them, and that's where the word of mouth and the word of book will grow.
When so many legislators are trying to shut down studying about racism, and so many public officials are denying the existence of systemic racism, do you think that The Man Who Lived Underground is going to help push back against that effort?
The Man Who Lived Underground is going to constitute a challenge because it is literature. It's not protest novel. It is magnificent literature. And if they are going to stand up against this type of literature, they're on losing ground.
I heard you say that, and I thought the same people who never had a problem with the adventures of Tom Sawyer or the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or even Uncle Tom's Cabin, had a problem with The Man Who Lived Underground being published in 1941. But we now know that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry, I had to read that, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, in high school. And I'm wondering if these people who are censoring will try to keep children from reading The Man Who Lived Underground in their schools and talking about it.
If something is pushed under, it gives that book even more power.
And I hope we can push it. Thank you.
I know you. Thank you. Yes, yes.
We have a question. Will the first 50 pages of the literature from the original manuscript that was removed from The Man Who Lived Underground ever be for public viewing?
Public viewing in what sense?
That was a question from the audience. So.
Well,
It's in the book.
It's in the book.
Yes. What
Yeah.
other kind of public viewing do they want?
Yeah. So another question is are there plans to create curriculum materials for secondary educators who wish to teach The Man Who Lived Underground? And if so, who will do that work?
I think Mary mentioned there was a guide already. I wasn't aware of that. I'm not aware that there is a guide, but Mary had mentioned there is. Yes.
Well, definitely should be one.
Yes.
We have descendants of the victims of the Elaine massacre on the call with us tonight. And I wonder if your father ever discussed Elaine with you.
Well, Garbo, as I told you, as you know, I'm trying to make sense of his attitude. And I'm writing this in my memoir. He introduced me to Martin Luther King when Martin Luther King came through Paris. And I mentioned what happened. My father wanted to introduce racism to me from exile in a way that would not shock me and would enable me to analyze things and be strong about withstanding it. And I'm here today as a result of what he taught me. He did not speak about things directly. He did it indirectly by opening up his library to me. The first photographs of lynchings I ever saw were in 12 Million Black Voices, which he wrote the text to. It was a Federal Writers Project book. And those were the first photographs of lynchings I saw in Paris.
Okay. Another question. Paris is known for its concentration of Black expatriates. Do you have any fond memories of other expatriates in France during your childhood that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm very, there's so much coming to my mind, I don't know what to say here. You know, I grew up in Paris during the Algerian War. France was at war with Algeria because Algeria wanted independence. And I'll always remember I used to be invited with my sister to the country house of my father's translator. And it was a very well-to-do house because she was a socialite. And one day I walked outside on the road and I was arrested. The police asked me where I lived, and I said, oh, I'm visiting here in this house. And they said, we don't believe you. And I said, why not? And they said, well, we'll go and ask them about you. And they went to the house of my father's translator, and she was angry. And they told her, but she looks like an Algerian. How come you have such guests? That was in 1954.
What
So,
other black expatriates can you recall running into while you lived in Paris? Because there were so many that were there during that time.
my father knew Josephine Baker. I don't know, do you remember Ollie Harrington, the creator of Bootsy, the cartoons?
Yes.
He was my father's friend. Who else? Oh, lots of people, lots of wonderful people. Chester Himes. Yes.
Did your father ever cross paths with Baldwin?
We could talk a long time about Baldwin. I'm devoting a whole chapter of my memoir to Baldwin, and the working title is Many Shades of Baldwin. Because there was a time where he adored my father, and there was another time where he attacked my father. And then after my father died, he was poignantly sorry. And I went to see him on his deathbed.
Are there another question, Ms. Hearn?
Well, she sort of answered it already. The listener says, since your father did not have a formal education in the traditional sense, who do you think the most influential sources were for his development intellectually? Who do you think influenced him the most in his writing?
That's such an enormous question for such a small person as me. Oh, you know, all I can say is that in American Hunger, he talks about Mencken as the journalist who influenced him. He talks about Mark Twain. Amongst the Black authors, he liked Franklin Fraser's Black Bourgeoisie. Great admirer of Franklin Fraser. He wrote the introduction to Black Metropolis by, oh, help me here. Oh, I've got a block.
St. Clair Drake,
Yes, thank you. Who's helping me here?
me.
Oh, okay, thank you. St. Clair Drake, yes. Horace Caton. Horace Caton was a wonderful friend of my father and wanted to write a biography on my father, and died before he could do that. And there's one other person I'd like to talk about, and that's the poet Langston Hughes, who was the last person to visit my father before my father went to the clinic where he died in Paris.
Okay. One last question. Can you speak a bit about the meanings of a life underground, either in the novel or as Richard Wright might have applied it to Black life more generally?
Ooh, some of these questions are, I mean, you could write an essay on them. Well, I was thinking about what Richard Wright's undergrounds biographically could be. And I remembered that when he set fire to his house, he hid underneath the house. And that was his first underground because he was 4 years old, right? And he was like watching the world from beneath the house and hoping he wouldn't be seen and wouldn't be caught. So that's a whole experience there, which Fred Daniels duplicates. In Memories of My Grandmother, my father also mentions, it's just one sentence, but I paid attention to it, the undergrounds of the concentration camps, because my mother was Jewish and a whole maternal branch of my mother's family was wiped out in the camps, cremated. So in 1942, that was the year of the concentration camps. I was born in real time as my mother's family was being cremated. I mean, you can go in all directions about undergrounds. You can think about underground railroads. You can think about the fact that when you go to the memorial, the lynching memorial, the ground slopes downwards. And what could this mean in terms of perhaps lynchings still being in the unconscious mind of our nation? Mourning our lynchings is still something that is repressed, that still has to be accomplished, is still underground. There's so much in our culture that the notion of underground speaks to. I mean, many other things. Just one biographical fact that when he finished Native Son, my father underwent 3 or 4 psychoanalytical sessions with a psychiatrist who was a friend. And he went into his own unconscious mind, just considered as an underground. I mean, you can go in a lot of directions here.
Well, thank you very much for your insights and the powerful questions. The audience, you've been wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Judge Griffen, for your moderation tonight, and Anna.
Thank you.
We are going to continue to talk to you, Ms. Wright,
Yes.
with the Richard Wright Summit. So I want to invite Elaine Marshall to come on and talk a bit about the summit coming up June 17th, which you will all get an invitation to. And also, if your questions were not answered, they will be answered. We will make sure that Ms. Wright and Reverend Griffen get them, and we will get those answered and emailed to you. So, Elaine, would you like to talk about the summit? Could you unmute yourself? You're muted. Okay. Now
Okay,
you're.
there we, yes, thank you. No
So you got to
problem.
start over because we didn't hear anything you said initially.
All righty, no problem at all. All right, so the first annual Richard Wright Summit, an international Zoom, leads us until June 10th. If you received a link for this gathering, you will be receiving an invitation to register for the summit. It begins on Thursday, June the 17th at 6 p.m. Central Time. We are calling it Richard and Julia Wright, a father-daughter legacy, ending capital punishment. The Reverend Judge Wendell Griffen will again be moderating with his thoughts of provoking wisdom. Mark your calendars, June 17th, 6 p.m. until 7:30 p.m. So we'll have time for a few more questions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that
Thank
with us.
you. Thank you.
And
You're welcome.
we are going to end tonight with letting you know how you can actually purchase The Man Who Lived Underground. And with our sessions, we always share with our participants, and we have a way. So if you're on this call tonight or on the Zoom, you have an opportunity to win the book. So Anna's going to share with us how we're going to do that. And thank you again, Julia, Reverend Griffen, and the audience. It's been amazing. It's almost 7:05. We want to be thoughtful of your time. This is a Tuesday night. Thank you very much.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Happy birthday.
Alrighty, so as we have done in our last couple of virtual book events, we do have the wonderful Wheel of Names. So if you stopped into the call today, your name is on here. So this is what I've been doing while everybody was talking, is typing names into the Wheel of Names. So we'll give the wheel a spin and see who is going to win a copy of The Man Who Lived Underground.
All right.
And if you win it and you already have it, you can donate it to a high school or a library in your town. So
this session now, so let me call you back.
Jennifer H,
All
you won.
all right. So Jennifer H, whoever you are, please put your information in the chat and we will make sure you get a copy of The Man Who Lived Underground. So Julia, say good night. You get the last word.
So greetings to people of Arkansas, and I will be back. And I have been very moved tonight to be with you, and you know why. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
You're welcome.
Yes.
All right. You're welcome. We're excited to talk to you. So good night, everyone, and have a good rest of the week. And we'll see you June 17th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.